Hello, and welcome to McDermott, Will, and Emery's 15th webinar of 2020 on renewable energy and the power markets. I am Ed Zelke. I'm Global Head of McDermott's Energy Project Finance Practice. And today's topic is achieving low-cost decarbonization through power markets, infrastructure, and grid operations. We're joined by our special guest, Rob Gramlich of Grid Strategies. And I'm also joined by my partner, Jacob Hollinger of our New York office. Let me remind the audience that we do have a question and answer feature in the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that come up during the webinar, please send them to us. We'll try to get to them if we can. If we can't, we'll see if we can catch up after the webinar. Before we get started, as we often do, we want to start with a couple audience participation surveys. As everyone knows, the future of FERC is going to depend a lot upon who gets elected in November, and it's been a busy month on the polls trending one way or another. And so we thought we'd just take a test of what folks are thinking with 4 months to go. With Biden ahead in the polls, is it extremely likely that he will be our next president? Is it probable? Do you think it's still 50-50, that the polls are going to be a lot like what we saw in 2016? Or do you think Donald Trump will pull it out and get reelected? So let's see kind of what the audience thinks. Submit your answers, and we'll what kind of a mix we have today. You know what? On the extremely likely on both ends, frankly, the folks thinking that Donald Trump might pull it out are close to 20%. I'd say that about half either are thinking that that'll be a repeat of 2016, or is still too low. So we're all over the board on this. Let's go to our next question. That one didn't give us much guidance. Sorry, Jacob and Rob. Let's talk about FERC. Going forward, what can FERC best do to help in the expansion of renewables? Encouraging long-distance, high-voltage transmission lines, assuring that existing transmission lines are used more efficiently, assuring that the capacity and ancillary services markets operate fairly, assuring competitive market pricing for all generation resources. Or we threw in an other button as well in case you had another idea. What can FERC, since that's our topic today, what can FERC do most effectively to help the expansion of renewables? And the answer is assuring competitive market pricing for all generation resources was 35%, followed closely by the expansion of high voltage transmission lines. So with those questions under our belt, let's turn to our program. Jacob Hollinger, could you introduce Rob and get us started?
Yes, thanks, Ed. And we're thrilled to have Rob Gramlich on the call today. Rob is the founder and president of Grid Strategies, LLC. It's a consulting firm focused on transmission and power market issues, reforms needed to get to a low carbon grid. Rob's really got deep experience in transmission and market policy issues. He is a former senior economist for PJM. He is a former economic advisor to former FERC chairman, Pat Wood. He worked on transmission and market policy issues for many years at the American Wind Energy Association as a senior vice president and also as interim CEO. So he's really got great experience in this area in a lot of different forums, and we're thrilled to have you on today, Rob. We're going to be talking obviously about low-cost decarbonization, but I think in the context of Joe Biden's recently announced plan to have zero emissions from the electricity grid by 2035. And we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ed to kind of tee up those questions.
You're on mute, Ed.
Ed, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today, Rob. You and I worked together for a number of years when you were at the American Wind Energy Association. Let's talk about the recently leaked Biden plan of $2 trillion and zero emissions by 2035. What would be some of the key elements of that from a transmission perspective?
Sure. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Jacob. It's great to be with you both. I probably go back 15 years with you, Ed, and I think 40 years with Jacob, but that's another story. And have worked with the McDermott practice, which is so good, and across a range of issues, tax credits and financing, and now, of course, I'm focusing on all the FERC issues and grid issues. So on your question, yeah, I think there are significant implications of all of the clean energy policies, the roughly 20 states that are looking at 100% decarbonization, and a very large number of utilities that have similar goals, and still around 30 states that have renewable portfolio standards. And now, we're hearing at least the candidate who's ahead in the polls has a 100% decarbonization plan in 15 years. So he also essentially doubled the speed of that from his earlier position. And so what does that mean? The reason for the lengthy title of this webinar is those three areas I think are distinct, and each of them important. Power markets I think are really important. If you think about the physical nature of wind and solar, which are going to lead the energy production in the future, these are remote resources and they're variable resources. And the way to get a firm power supply, the first thing you do is you operate on a very large regional basis with very fast dispatch. So every 5 minutes, you can adjust how much you need from the other sources. And so regional transmission organizations, RTOs and ISOs, they essentially provide that, but we're going to need those in other regions, and we're going to need to fix the seams between those RTOs and make some other improvements inside their markets. Infrastructure is the second major category. I actually voted for that one on your poll. I put that one first. I think a significant grid build out to access these very low cost but remote resources is going to be critical. As you know, there's two major inputs to wind and solar projects. It's the resource itself, and it's the real estate. And both of those are much better out in remote areas on farmland, et cetera, and further away from population centers. So accessing those, I think, will be cost effective. Transmission is economic if you do it at scale. The dollars per megawatt are much lower at a large scale. And transmission also helps with the variability as well, because you can end up sending power back and forth between areas. If the wind's not blowing in one place, it likely is somewhere else. And then the last one that doesn't get as much attention, I think, as it deserves is grid operations. We can actually squeeze a lot more juice out of the existing network than we do. There's a variety of reasons why it doesn't happen, mostly related to the incentives that the regulated transmission owners have. But there are these technologies, some of which have been around for a while, some are newer, but they're all commercially available now. They're actually being widely deployed in other countries like Australia and the UK. And I'm talking about dynamic line ratings, power flow control, topology optimization, factors like that can reduce congestion over the existing network. And so I think to put the strains on the grid that these clean energy goals will have, I think those features will be needed as well. So I think those three buckets will need to see significant changes, and FERC is right there squarely in the middle of each of them and can lead those changes.
So Rob, a lot to unpack there in the three buckets. Let's break it down and maybe take them one at a time. But let's start with the kind of grid expansion, the kind of second bucket of those. I mean, one, it sounded a little bit of note of skepticism. That's a lot of land to acquire, maybe, and a lot of environmental issues and permitting issues to deal with. how do you see, how do you see a new administration overcoming those challenges? And are there kind of maybe less impactful alternatives like microgrids and storage that might be pursued instead or in conjunction with that?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of transmission capacity expansion that can be done on existing rights of way. So you can upgrade the conductors, reconductor lines. There are also new innovations, like there's a company, Sue Green, in the Midwest, putting underground transmission along a railway. So, hopefully that will work and will be scalable and exportable to other areas. People are thinking about highway rights of way. So there are a lot of those opportunities. And then there are some, probably some need for new lines and some new rights of way. One thing, this gets into potentially legislative issues, but one area people are looking at is just better ways to engage states so that they reach better regional agreements on the regional capacity they need. We actually did a lot of transmission investment between around 2008 and 2015. Like in the upper Midwest, we had all the states on board with that. They wanted to export. At that time, it was really mainly wind. Now it's both wind and solar, but all the states got together and wanted to do it. MISO put it together, FERC approved the plan. So that winning formula, essentially, you can attribute half of the current wind industry, literally 50 gigawatts out of the just over 100 gigawatts, directly to plans like that. You could point to the 5 or 6 regional plans like that. And that didn't, that was done with the current siting and permitting construct. So, it can be done, but certainly alleviating the permitting challenges in the state and local issues there would also be helpful.
Rob, do we have the money to do that? Is this going to be a new burden on, again, an area where we have falling power prices nationally, have had for a number of years? Do the renewable energy developers have the cash to build these new transmission lines, or is this going to take some sort of federal program to carry the financial load?
Well, FERC has the authority to assign the costs across all of the load in a way that is roughly commensurate with the beneficiaries. So the beneficiaries pay. That's kind of the law of the land right now. That's how most of that transmission got built. In Texas, ERCOT, the famous CREZ lines, competitive renewable energy zones, those got built. They ended up just kind of what they call peanut buttering or socializing the cost across everybody. Other regions in the FERC jurisdiction world do it more according to the beneficiary. So that's how I imagine, I think most transmission will get paid for. There's also an opportunity for a tax credit for transmission. We at Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, we have a webinar on our website. We had Jigger Shaw, Christina Hayes, and Michael Skelly talking about that. Senator Heinrich has a bill. So that's, a possibility, of course, in a stimulus context, an economic recovery bill. You could have other funding sources like the Smart Grid Investment Grant program could plus up the bulk transmission part of that. So there are a lot of ways to pay for it. Putting some of the costs on the generators is one way, but I don't think will be, and I certainly don't think should be the main way it gets paid for.
Thank you.
While we're on costs, maybe it's worth talking about the kind of the other bucket you mentioned, or power markets in general, and what kind of changes do you see coming in power market design? And kind of follow-up question is might carbon pricing play any type of role in that?
Sure. So the first thing with power market design is I think we want a flexible system so that you have better price formation and the kind of the lingo used at FERC. So for example, when power gets scarce, the prices should be high. It's kind of economics 101 that the price gets set by the demand side value when when a commodity is scarce, not by the the operating cost of the last supply side resource dispatch, which tends to be how we do it in electricity. So ERCOT is again leading the way on that one. The other ISOs and RTOs are following, but there's a lot of demand side resource and storage out there that could enter on the prospect of basically hitting the peaks, hitting the scarce periods and the high prices when they exist. And the nice thing about a flexible design like that is it's not based on a bunch of stakeholders sitting around and doing politics and horse trading over market design, which tends to happen in capacity markets and some of the other areas. It's really more of an engineering based system, and if the system's scarce, the price gets high. So if we get the right prices at the right times and places, that does a lot. Now, I'm not one of those economists who says that getting the right prices does everything. We still got institutional issues. So we could talk about how do you make sure that there's buyers who are out there procuring power, signing long-term contracts, signing PPAs, that Ed can negotiate here. We need to make sure there's real buyers that are creditworthy, who can do that. That's more of I would call that market structure, and it involves much more state jurisdiction. But FERC and states need to work together on that to make sure that we have kind of the whole value chain, working from demand through the power markets and to suppliers and lenders to make the whole system work.
Rob, you mentioned capacity markets. Commissioner Glick has suggested that we need to significantly either revamp our capacity markets or maybe eliminate them entirely. Thoughts on that?
Yes, he did say that, and I thought that was helpful. I think it is something that requires a reevaluation. I think it's important first to start with the mental framework, like what should we be shooting for in electricity products? And I think the answer is engineering-based services that are needed by the system, and then the compensation is based on delivery of those services. So the problem with capacity markets is it's not really based on an engineering need. It's not one of the essential reliability services. If you look that up on the NERC website, they don't list capacity. And of course, capacity is the ability to deliver something. It's not the actual delivery of that thing. And so it automatically gets into this subjective debate about, whose resource is prettier, and then everybody, hires their advocates to go into the stakeholder processes to talk about how wonderful their resource is. Well, I think we should again be looking at what does the system need. Let's start with that. And there's reactive power, there's spinning reserves, and as renewable penetration gets higher, you might end up needing different types of reserves at different times. So that's what I would recommend in such a process: is let's define the services, and then let's pay the value of those services. And I think a lot of generators get fearful of capacity market reform, but hopefully they would come to the table happily, knowing that look, those generators can provide a lot of valuable resources, and if they get paid accurately for delivery of those services, they'll come out just fine.
Good.
Rob, what about a clean energy standard? National Clean Energy Standard. I think that's one of the aspects that Biden has talked about in his plan. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't really spend much time on that personally anymore, but I did see that. It tends to be popular. Clean energy standards and renewable standards tend to be very popular at the states. It seems to be easier for elected officials to support those rather than a carbon tax that comes across like a penalty for, driving your car. So, smarter minds than mine will work on what can pass. I do think it'll be interesting to see, if Democrats win the Senate and the White House, certain things can be passed under budget reconciliation with 50 votes. Other things require 60 votes. Tends to be the dollars, the taxes, and spending that can pass with the 50. So those types of things might be easier than the energy policy type actions.
I wanted to go back to something you said before about needing more RTOs, or the significant role of RTOs and independent system operators, in kind of achieving fast dispatch. I mean, not all of the country has it right now, right? So, how do you see that kind of potential federal demand for that versus kind of state prerogatives? How do you see that playing out, and how might a new administration address that challenge?
Right. Well, Congress has looked at that issue. There's a House bill that includes an RTO mandate that's out there. Some states in the Southeast are looking at competitive reforms, including potential RTO membership. They've seen the harm that is caused by having utilities able to essentially write a blank check or throw anything on the rate-based credit card, and so they're looking for some competitive forces there. Of course, across the West, they've talked about more competitive forces and an RTO, and they have an active energy imbalance market. Just this week, some Southeast utilities announced an energy imbalance market idea or something like it. So that will be interesting. Of course, states have a lot of authority over this. Utilities have a lot of political power. So, it's not clear what Congress or the administration would be really willing to take on and do in that regard. But I would expect they would be supportive of any movement in that direction.
Rob, we've gotten a number of audience questions here, and I know we just have a little time left. I want to make sure we get to a couple of them. Was there anything that ERCOT put in place? You mentioned ERCOT as kind of the shining example of how you can bring renewables onto the grid. Is there anything they did right that could be a good example, national example?
Yeah, well, I think the ERCOT market design and the ERCOT transmission planning were both great examples for the rest of the country. If I had my druthers, I would basically put those in place in the whole rest of the country. I mentioned the competitive renewable energy zone policy on transmission, and then the ERCOT market. The grid operator focuses on being an air traffic controller in terms of operating the markets just within the day, and they kind of stick to their knitting. They haven't had the RTO mission creep that has plagued some of the other RTOs, and they haven't had to get into the subjective capacity market debates. Now, again, a critical piece of that is making sure if you do that, somebody is actually buying long-term power and signing contracts and signing PPAs, and they have done that in ERCOT. Any other state that goes that direction would have to do that as well. The challenge is with the other 13 states that have retail competition, then the issue is somebody really buying on their behalf? Are retail competitive suppliers actually thinking about long-term resource procurement? And in my view, they should, but those other 13 states, they don't really do that well enough.
There's another question, kind of the issue between states and RTOs. Is the suggestion here is that are we moving more towards just a state procurement model in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, rather than letting the soft nudges of the RTOs control the market? What's your thoughts on that? Well,
first I would say when FERC set up RTOs, they were not supposed to be the buyer for everybody. There was never, and I worked for a Bush-appointed Republican chairman whose mission was to benefit customers. And when he talked about customers, this is Pat Wood, he was talking about real customers, electricity buyers. When people talk about RTOs versus states, sometimes I think there's this somehow perception, I don't know where it came from, that the RTO is supposed to be the buyer, and that generators are supposed to be able to sell, sort of like have a purple put to sell to the RTO, like in their capacity market. And I just can't figure out where that came from. I don't see it in the law. I don't see it in any policy statements or any economist's writings. But anyway, there is that perception. So again, I think we need to first figure out, back to what I said, we need to figure out who is the buyer, who is supposed to be buying long-term power. And a state has two options. They could rely on retail competition, and if they do that, they need to fix their default service and do it more like ERCOT, where you have real competitive suppliers who can actually sign multi-year contracts. Or they can have a regulated system for, maybe they want to do it for all the residential load, or maybe they want to do it for all load. That's a state choice. And then you're kind of in an integrated resource planning type of system where the utility says, here's how much I need to buy, and the state approves that. There is a third option where, like in Illinois, New York, California, some states have like energy offices where they could just kind of take over buying on behalf of everybody. A lot of people like that model. Personally, I'd rather have a more decentralized market-based model, give people the signals and the tools and let them make their own decisions. I wouldn't be surprised if some states do that more, have the state kind of take it over. The other thing that comes up a lot in these debates is, what if a state says, for whatever reason, I want to do offshore wind, or I want to do this resource that I like, and it's near me and there's jobs, and for whatever reason I like it and I want to do it. Then the question is, okay, well, they're allowed to do it, so of course they can and should, but then what effect does that have on the rest of the market? And then that gets into tricky FERC issues. I mean, to me, it's sort of like, well, so, I'm sorry if we're playing kind of musical chairs and, there wasn't a chair left for you if the buyers all decided to buy something else. And the state made that choice on their behalf. That's kind of tough. You didn't get a customer. But on the other hand, any and all resources that are out there will still have other products they can sell to the system. So that's where it gets back to defining the reliability products that are needed and compensating them correctly, which is usually, when the system's scarce, compensating them at the demand side value, like the reliability value of lost load, not just on, the operating cost of the last unit. And if you do that, then, you have a perfectly well-balanced system, both in the short and long run.
Rob, on that last point, do you think that there's going to need to be a legislative solution on that, on how you price those reliability services, or is that something that it will be a combination of FERC and legislative, or just FERC alone? I mean, how do you see that playing out?
On reliability service definition and compensation, I think FERC can handle that under their authority, and I expect they will, under at least, if Commissioner Glick becomes chairman, I expect he would want to do that. Legislatively, I mean, I have seen legislative proposals here and there to get FERC and RTOs out of the business of second guessing state energy policy. And I've heard Joe Biden talk about making sure states can do what they want to do, like with California, auto efficiency standards. So I would imagine that would be a strong emphasis for anybody coming in under the new regime if Biden wins.
I know we're running out of time, and Ed probably has a question, but I do want to ask you one big picture question, if we have a minute. 10 years ago, coal was 50% of the U.S. electricity generation. Now it's about 20%, and renewable energy prices have dropped so dramatically. I mean, where do you see us in 10 years from now?
Yeah, well, and Ed, this ties to Ed's question about the cost of transmission. I mean, I think we should get used to a different structure where transmission does end up being a much bigger part of the bill, but you pay for the transmission in order to access the really cheap generation. So I do think wind and solar and storage costs will keep coming down, and we will rely on them for the bulk of our use. And you can get to 60, 70, 80%. of that, the last 10 or 20% tends to get very expensive, but let's, for the next 10 years, let's worry about getting towards 50 and beyond. And I do think we will have very low energy prices when we focus on renewables and storage, however that happens, just with the market or with Clean Energy Standard or what have you. But again, we really need to work hard on getting the right amount of transmission and doing kind of a benefit cost framework to make sure we do it in the right places. But I think when we do a proper benefit cost analysis, we're going to find a lot of transmission that's in the black and should move forward, and that will go into basically the transmission rate base. Consumers will pay that. It'll be a bigger share of their overall bill, but overall, the whole idea is to have a lower cost overall bill under that framework. It'll be low carbon, it'll be more reliable, and it'll be efficient.
Great. Thank you. I think with that, Jacob, we're going to have to wrap it up. We're a little over time, but we could probably go on a lot longer, but we do have a hardish stop. But I wanted to thank you, Jacob, for joining me today. And of course, many thanks to Rob Gramlich, the CEO of Grid Strategies, for being our guest today. It was incredibly interesting and I think very beneficial to our listening audience.
Thanks, Ed. Great to be with you.
Thank you.